My name is Dominique Cooper, and if there's one constant in my life, it's my dad, Herschel Russo. He's always been my safe haven, the person I turn to no matter what. He made me feel seen, valued, and understood. Growing up, our house looked picture perfect. Big windows, a white picket fence, the kind of home people dream about. But inside, it felt cold. My mom, Caroline, was all about appearances. She loved order, rules, and keeping things spotless. Emotions weren't her strong suit, and I never felt like I fit into her idea of perfection. I always felt like I was too much for her world. My dad, though, was different. He was warm, loud, and full of life. He didn't care if I made a mess or broke the rules. He let me be myself in ways my mom never could. I'd spend hours in his workshop, watching him tinker and fix things, listening to his stories. Those moments with him felt like home. As my mom focused more on her career and spent less time at home, my dad and I grew even closer. By my teenage years, he felt like the only person who truly knew me. He never missed a dance recital, never forgot the little things I cared about. Late at night, we'd sit on the couch talking about my dreams, fears, and secrets I didn't share with anyone else. He always listened as if every word mattered. Over time, I started relying on him more and more. It wasn't just emotional support. I felt comforted by his presence. I liked how safe I felt when he'd wrap his arm around me as we watched TV or pull me close when I began to drift off. It felt natural, familiar, and never crossed my mind as anything more. But when I turned 18, things started to change. With my mom traveling constantly for work, it was just the two of us at home most of the time. Late night conversations turned into mornings spent together in our pajamas, sipping coffee and talking about everything under the sun. We grew so comfortable in each other's company that I started to forget where the boundaries were. I began noticing things about him, the way his hands moved, the sound of his laughter, and the way his gaze lingered at times. It made my stomach flip in ways I didn't understand. Or maybe I did, but didn't want to admit. Some things, the first time something crossed the line, it didn't feel planned or intentional. We were on the couch, like always. I leaned into him, my head resting on his chest. Then he looked down at me, and I looked up at him. In that moment, something shifted. Neither of us pulled away. I remember his hand brushing against me, and from that moment on, things were different. That night changed everything. It wasn't planned, and it didn't feel like some dramatic shift at first. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. My dad, Herschel Russo, had always been my constant, the one who made me feel safe just by being near. Growing up, I thought it was because he was my father, my protector. But looking back, maybe there was more to it. My childhood home looked perfect on the outside. Big windows, white picket fence, the image of a happy family. But inside, it often felt cold. My mom, Caroline, was sharp and distant, more focused on appearances than emotions. She cared about how the house looked, about keeping things tidy and orderly, but rarely noticed how I felt. I stopped trying to reach her after a while. My dad was different. He noticed when I was upset, sitting by my bedside to talk or holding me until I stopped crying. He never told me to toughen up or act my age. He just let me be me. As I grew older, we became even closer, especially when my mom's work kept her away for long stretches. We built routines, late night movies, eating ice cream straight from the carton, and conversations that lasted until we fell asleep on the couch. At first, I didn't think much of it. I told myself it was normal. But then I started noticing little things: the warmth of his arm around me, the way his hand lingered when he brushed my hair back. I didn't pull away, and neither did he. I began dressing differently around him, opting for softer, thinner clothes. I told myself it was for comfort, but deep down, I knew it was more. I noticed how his gaze followed me, how his voice softened when he spoke to me. I didn't question it. I didn't stop it. Then came the night my mom was away, like so many other nights. We were on the couch, sharing a blanket, the TV playing in the background. We weren't even watching. It was just us in that quiet, familiar space that had become ours. I don't know what started it. Maybe the way he looked at me when I laughed, like I was the only thing in the world. Or maybe it was how I leaned into him, my head resting on his chest, my fingers brushing his arm without thinking. The air felt heavier, warmer, like we both knew something unspoken was happening. His hand moved first, slow and deliberate, sliding down my arm. When I looked up at him, his eyes didn't waver. In that moment, everything changed. I remembered that everything came from him. And his hand that night marked a turning point, a moment that changed everything I thought I knew about myself, my father, and the fragile lines we crossed without fully understanding the weight of it all. I should have pulled back. I should have said something, but I didn't. Instead, I let him keep going. His fingers brushed through my hair, slow and careful, tracing the outline of my face like he was memorizing every detail. When his hand lingered against my cheek and his lips met mine, I didn't resist. I kissed him back. I didn't feel wrong in that instant. It felt inevitable, like we had been moving toward this moment all along and finally stopped pretending otherwise. His kiss was tentative at first, soft and searching, but quickly deepened, and I matched him. I don't know how long it lasted. Time felt different, stretched and blurred until I couldn't tell if it had been seconds or hours. All I remember is the heat of his hands, the weight of his body as he leaned closer, and my inability to stop. Afterward, we sat in silence. The stillness between us was deafening, louder than anything we'd said before. I wanted to speak, to break the moment and find a way back to what we were before, but I couldn't find the words. I waited for him to say something, that it was a mistake, that we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross. But he didn't. Instead, he touched my face again, gentler this time, and kissed my forehead. For a fleeting moment, I let myself believe that maybe it wasn't as bad as it felt. But the guilt came later, creeping in, during the quiet of my room as I replayed everything in my head. I tried to convince myself it wasn't what it seemed, that it wasn't wrong because it hadn't been planned. It just happened. People cross lines all the time, I told myself. We aren't hurting anyone. My mom, after all, was never home. She barely noticed us, and I told myself she didn't love him the way he deserved. Maybe, just maybe, I was the one who could give him what he'd been missing: love, attention, and understanding. That's how I justified it. how I slept that night. But deep down, I knew it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. In the days that followed, everything felt different. The house, our routines, even the air between us. It all carried the weight of what had happened. Every glance and every touch felt charged, heavy with unspoken meaning. It started small. His hand would brush mine as we passed in the hallway. His eyes would linger a moment too long over breakfast. Then there were the text messages. Miss you already, or can't stop thinking about you. I'd stare at my phone, my heart pounding as I typed back, trembling with the thrill of it all. The nights when my mom was away became our sanctuary. We stopped pretending to be careful. We'd sit together on the couch, my legs tangled with his hand tracing lazy circles on my back. When the tension grew too thick, he'd cut my face and kiss me like he couldn't hold back. It wasn't rushed or careless. It was deliberate, each touch slow and meaningful. We found ways to be alone even when my mom was home. Late night walks, quick errands. It didn't matter. The secrecy made it more thrilling, the hunger between us impossible to ignore. But my mom wasn't oblivious. She started noticing the changes. Her sharp eyes followed me everywhere, her questions cutting deeper. Why are you always with him? Why do you act like you run this house? Her tone was venomous, her suspicion growing with every word. My dad's response was always the same. He'd defend me. Every time he stood up for me, it only made things worse. The tension in the house grew unbearable, like a storm waiting to break. There were nights I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning with the inevitability of it all. I knew what we were doing couldn't last. I knew it was dangerous. But when we were alone, it didn't feel that way. It felt like we were the only ones who truly understood each other, the only ones saving each other from the emptiness of everything else. I should have known someone would eventually figure it out. The signs were everywhere, but I was too wrapped up in the world we'd created to care. Or maybe I cared too much. I didn't want to let it go. I told myself it wasn't hurting anyone. My mom barely cared about him anyway. She was gone more than she was home. And even when she was here, she acted like we were strangers. I convinced myself I made him happy. I could see it in his eyes and the way he touched me. How could something that felt so good be so bad? Yet the guilt lingered. It crept into quiet moments, like when my mom kissed him goodbye before another trip. I hated her for touching him, hated her for assuming he was still hers. But then I'd hate myself for feeling jealous, for wanting something I was never supposed to want. Sometimes I thought about what would happen if we got caught, what people would say, how it would destroy us. But then he'd pull me into his arms, tell me everything was fine, and I'd believe him. I wanted to believe him. I told myself we weren't breaking anything that wasn't already broken. Maybe that was true, but the deeper we fell into each other, the harder it became to see a way out. And then it all came crashing down. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, and the memory still feels sharp, like shattered glass cutting into me. My mom came home early, hours earlier than we expected. I was curled up on the couch with my dad, his hand resting on my thigh like it belonged there. Neither of us moved. It had become too natural by then, too normal. I didn't hear the door open or her footsteps. What I heard was the gasp, a sharp, guttural sound that froze the air around us. When I turned to look at her, her face was pale with shock, her eyes bouncing between his hand me and him. What is this? She whispered, her voice breaking halfway through. My stomach dropped. My dad tried to speak first. Caroline, it's not. Don't you dare, she snapped, her voice slicing through the room. I wanted to say something to defend us, to make her understand. But the words wouldn't come, and before I could even try, she grabbed her keys and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. Everything unraveled after that. My mom didn't come home that night or the next. When she finally did, it wasn't to talk. It was to pack a suitcase. My dad begged her to stay, but she wouldn't listen. She wouldn't even look at him. She said, when you're done, can I come inside? Well, look at me. The way she stared, like I wasn't her daughter anymore, like I was someone she couldn't recognize, someone she hated, cut deeper than, anything she could have said. You're disgusting, she said, her voice cold and flat. Both of you. I wanted to tell her she didn't understand that it wasn't what she thought, but what was the point? She wouldn't have believed me. And maybe she was right not to. She left that night. She didn't just leave the house. She left me. No calls, no texts, not even a check-in to see if I was okay. And I hated her for that almost as much as I hated myself. My dad tried to hold everything together, but it was like trying to grip sand. It slipped through his fingers, no matter how tightly he held on. The more things fell apart, the more we clung to each other, even though we both knew it was wrong by then. We were too far gone to stop. My mom didn't keep quiet. She told people, friends, neighbors, anyone who would listen. It wasn't long before the whispers started at the grocery store, at the gas station. Even walking down the street, I felt eyes on me. Did you hear about the Russo girl? What kind of father does that? What kind of daughter? I stopped leaving the house. I stopped answering my phone. Friends I'd known for years suddenly disappeared. Even the ones who called only wanted to pry, like my life had turned into a tabloid headline for them to dissect. My dad didn't handle it much better. He lost his job. His boss didn't say it was because of the rumors, but we both knew the truth. People didn't want him around their families. They didn't trust him. The worst part was that he didn't even fight it. He just let it happen, like some part of him believed he deserved it. It became pariahs, shut out, shut down. All we had left was each other. I can't fully explain what it's like to lose everything, to have people look at you like you're less than human, broken in ways they can't even imagine. So that's what it felt like. And maybe we were broken, but we weren't sorry. If you've made it this far, let me know what you think in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories, because trust me, this one's far from over. After everything came out, I didn't leave the house for weeks. Every time I glanced out the window, it felt like someone was watching, waiting for me to crumble. Maybe I already had. I didn't know who I was anymore. A victim, a villain, both. At first, I avoided the truth. I buried myself in the comfort of my dad's presence, pretending we could still exist in our own little world. But the silence in the house grew deafening. Louder than any whispered reassurance he offered. And then the question started in my own mind during sleepless nights. What have I done? The shame came in waves. Some mornings it was like I'd been swallowed whole. Other days I felt an overwhelming anger at my mom for abandoning me, at the world for judging me, at myself for not knowing how to make it stop. I hated that part of me still wanted him, that I still reached for him when I felt lost. I really do love therapy was my mom's idea, but it didn't feel like love. It felt like punishment. You need help, she said, her voice cold and final. Maybe she was right. I went because I didn't know what else to do. I didn't know how to fix myself. My therapist asked questions I didn't want to answer. And how did it start? Did you feel pressure? Did you feel love? Did you feel safe? And hardest one of all, do you regret it? I didn't know how to answer. I still don't. Mom and I barely spoke at first. Every conversation turned into an argument or ended with her in tears, walking out. She wanted me to hate him, to see him as a monster who ruined my life. But he wasn't a monster to me. He was my dad. That made it harder to let go. Eventually, she stopped trying to fix me. She moved into a new apartment and began acting like I didn't exist. Maybe it hurt her too much to look at me, or maybe she just didn't care anymore. Either way, it left me more alone than ever. My dad tried to stay close, but the guilt was too heavy for both of us. Some nights he'd sit across the room instead of next to me. Some mornings he'd leave before I woke up. Slowly, we stopped talking about the future. We stopped pretending we could rebuild what we'd destroyed. When he finally packed his bags and left, he didn't say goodbye. He left a note on the kitchen table. Who did? And I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt empty. I don't know where to go from here. Part of me wants to believe that I can start over, that I can live a normal life again. But another part of me wonders if I even deserve that. What do people see when they look at me now? A victim? A predator? Sometimes I think about how it might have been if we'd never been caught. Would it have been easier? Could we have kept living in that fantasy, untouched by judgment? Deep down, I know the truth. We were always going to end up here, broken and lost. I still dream about him. Some nights I wake up with the memory of his touch. For a second, it feels real. Then it's gone and I'm alone again. Maybe that's what I deserve, or maybe it's not. I don't know. But like, I wish I had answers. I wish I could make sense of it all. But I can't. All I know is that I'm still here trying to figure out what comes next. Maybe you read this and think I'm disgusting, or maybe you understand more than you want to admit. Either way, I want to hear from you. What would you do if your world fell apart like mine? How would you move forward? Let me know in the comments. And if this story made you feel something, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.